Hello, my name is Xingxing. I am an assistant professor of design and technology at Parsons.
Hi, I'm Catherine Moriwaki, Associate Professor of Media Design at Parsons.
I'm John Packles. I am a designer and a part-time faculty teaching a section of this course, Critical Computation Lab. Today, I am going to be talking about this topic of data and identity on the internet. And I am going to be talking about some of the stuff that I have made, but I am going to spend the bulk of this time talking about how this week's topic, the history of the internet, has served as inspiration for my work and how it frames a lot of the work that I've done. So, in other words, I'm going to take you down a bit of a research rabbit hole that I've been on for the past year or so. And I will also share a link with resources that are related to this topic in case anybody wants to dive in deeper. I want to start by talking about this idea of the internet as a mechanism for collective memory. And I want to go back to this machine that gets talked about in every media studies course as being this kind of internet before the internet. And it's called the Memex, and it was created in 1945 by somebody named Vannevar Bush as the solution to a very specific problem, which was that within the scientific community, there was more and more information, and there needed to be a way to organize it in a way that it was accessible to people, and it was organized so that people would be able to find the important information within like a sea of distractions. So he talks about this idea of a civilization that has become so complex that we need to mechanize our records in order to push experiments to their logical conclusions instead of being limited by our human memory. So the solution that he came up with was the Memex, and it was this machine that was aimed to organize information in a way that was more akin to how the human brain works, where documents are connected through associative links instead of sorted in alphabetical order or by some other method. And this, for Bush, would solve the problems of the information overload at the time. And what he was after was building this collective memory machine, both for science, but also as this conceptual exercise in like how can we organize information on a larger scale. The assumption that's being made here, and I am drawing a lot from the work of Wendy Chun in a piece called The Enduring Ephemeral. And she writes, in Bush's writing and in the prognoses for the information revolution more generally, there is no difference between access to and understanding the record, between machine reading and human reading and comprehension, between information and argument. And furthermore, his argument assumes that human records make possible that the construction of an overarching archive of human knowledge in which there is no gap, no absence, a summation of human knowledge. And I think that the Memex is fascinating to look at this point because we have in the internet a system that in many ways follows the logic and the information models that were set out by the Memex. And yet, on one hand, this issue of finding significant truthful information among a sea of, of distractions, the problem that Bush was hoping to solve, it seems now like it's more pressing than ever. And furthermore, despite widespread access to the internet, it's still nowhere near this idea of a summation of human knowledge, a complete archive. There are still gaps, there are still falsities, and there's still biases. And I'm thinking at this point about the work of Mimi Onuoha, whose work investigates this idea of missing data sets. So this is an ongoing project of hers called the Library of Missing Datasets. And she describes these as the blank spots that exist in spaces that are otherwise data saturated. And she makes this point that wherever there are large amounts of data collected, there will be empty spaces where no data live, which I think is a really kind of interesting counterpoint to this idea of a complete archive. So I want to talk also about the internet as becoming about us, about people. So Gia Tolentino says, if the internet is the central organ of contemporary life, selfhood is its engine. And that is, I think, certainly true about today's internet. Personal information is the basis for so much of what the internet is built on. But to go back and think about the underlying structure of the internet, for a moment, not thinking about like what was built on top of it, it is not inherently social. It is not inherently based on personal information. It's, as a technology, a way of organizing, accessing, sharing information across networks. But it's not prescriptive in saying that this is going to be about personal information. But starting very early on, when people started having access to the internet outside of military and universities, people found ways to make the internet about themselves. The internet became this place for self-expression, for forming communities. You were no longer bound to the structures of the offline world. There was this sense of freedom to express yourself, to perform the parts of your identity that maybe didn't fit into your particular offline life. I also want to note here that I was not alive during this time, so I might have an overly glossy view of it. But I think all in all, there is definitely truth to this. So fast forward to today, and these very kind of human urges for expression and connection has been turned back on us to become the basis for this information-driven economy. This is kind of like an infamous quote from Mark Zuckerberg, who was arguing for singular identity on social media. He says, having two identities for yourself is an example of a lack of integrity, which is quite different from the early imagined utopian internet, this place where one could present their complex selfhood. And identity is complex. We perform different parts of ourselves in different contexts and different conditions. But in order for identity to become a resource that is valuable to platforms, it must be flattened, distorted, simplified in certain ways. So a lot of my thinking around this topic comes from the work of Dana Boyd, who was investigating these questions all the way back in the early 2000s. And she argues for the importance of awareness, of self-awareness in social interactions, and about how the complexity of identity online makes it extremely hard to have this kind of awareness. So I really like this quote. In daily interactions, people are aware of their presentation. They know what they're wearing, they have a sense of their facial expressions, and they can easily comprehend the reactions presented by others. Yet online, people produce immense quantities of data about their identity and behavior without an awareness of what that data is, let alone what it represents. People do not have the tools to be aware of their presentation online. So it's not just about how you behave outwardly in a chat room or the tone that you portray on Twitter. Every action that is taken online is recorded and archived and used in a way to construct your identity on the internet. And the collection of this data, which is deeply personal and effective in constructing this picture, is mostly invisible to internet users. It is information that is about us, but it is not for us. It is meant to be processed by machines, not read by people. So I started a series of projects while I was a student in DT, where I focused on creating personal context for personal data. And in these projects, I'm asking this question of what would the data that we create through everyday actions look like if it took a form that was meant for our own personal use? So while many tech companies allow you to download your personal data, it comes in a form that is not of very much use to us. To go back to the beginning of this talk, it is access to this information without a means to engage with that information in a personally meaningful way. And I'm thinking here about some of the work by Marissa Parham, who talks about this question of what is gained and what is lost in this transition from one kind of narrative space, the local and the personal, into other kinds of uses, the archival, the computational, and so on. And she's talking about, she's questioning what is at stake when we talk about data only in the context of, big data, data processing. And she offers up this alternate term to be used, which she calls datum storytelling. And it really gets at this idea of what happens when you actually sort through massive collections of data. When you go deeper and deeper and zoom in, like what is contained in this information on the smallest scale. So I'm interested in this question of, repurposing personal data for two reasons. And on one hand, I am just amazed by the sheer, mass of information that we create, and I'm interested in what we can learn about ourselves and our communities and our lives through looking into this data. And then at the same time, thinking about issues of agency, I'm just fascinated with these documents of data as a material and what I can gain from them on a personal level. But at the same time, in looking into this data, it's hard to ignore questions of why is this data being recorded? Why is it being collected? In what ways is it being used and processed that are hard to see when just engaging in everyday behavior on the internet? So the first project that I want to talk briefly about is called Waypoints Journal, which was the first exploration of this question for me. And what it is a device that hangs on my bedroom wall, and it receives my location data throughout the day and draws the path that I've taken. And at the end of that day, I come home, I see where I've done. This document has been created, and maybe I add some notes to it, maybe I hang it up, maybe I throw it out. But I was really interested in this act of making this data only for myself, seeing what I could use it for if it took a form that was very different from the form that it takes on the web. And so after I did this project, I wanted to go deeper into exploring these questions, and I discovered Google Takeout, which is Google's offering that allows users to access and download the data that has been collected from them by Google. And I downloaded my archive, and the thing that was the most interesting to me was this document called myactivity.json, which contained close to 80,000 search queries that I have made over the course of an entire decade. And as I am moving through this document, I'm coming across searches that are really kind of personal as I am looking through this document, there are these things that are like deeply personal, and it's I'm seeing it as this document that is like a journal that I have kept for a decade, and it's been really consistent, and I've kept it up for a really long time. And so I wanted to do experiments with how I could use that information and give them a context. I spent many months building tools to organize this information and present it in different ways that were meaningful to me. Um, so here's a sampling of that. So I was spending this time making these tools mostly for myself as a personal investigation, but I wanted to see what other people might find when they use these tools. So I started this website. It's called Search Record, and it is home to a few different tools where you can upload your search information that you get from Google and present it back to yourself in different ways. And it is really kind of this like delightful experience of creating these poems out of your own data. And what I wanted to achieve here was, on one hand, this is um, a very kind of like fun, lighthearted experience. Um, but it's hard to move through this data without eventually getting to this point of thinking about like why does this exist in the first place, and like what else is out there about me that I don't know about. So there are really two sides to it there. This is a video from a very um, early time at Google. So I want um, to end this by saying that with a lot of this type of work that I do, um, I am actually more interested in the process of exploring the possibilities of what can be done with this data than I am with the exact final form that they take. And this action of um, creating your own context for this information um, and what can you learn from doing that is really interesting to me, and I want to continue doing that kind of work.
Okay, what I found really interesting about your presentation is, the fact that you started by looking at the very basic infrastructure of how the internet work before all the add-ons, right? And the fact that it's a structure where there are different nodes in different location, in this case, different cities that can cross communicate and share information with each other. Um, I I think I think that they're just like a kind of a nice dialogue between that very beginning infrastructure of the internet to like your kind of like very personal and like desire for almost like a sense of like intimacy with your own data and wanting a kind of very personal relationship with it that doesn't doesn't always naturally like fit into the context of you know um like node to node communication across the country or across the globe. So I guess like has this sort of process of building a personal relationship and personal representation of your data um, like gave you any new ideas on how you might want a more personal version of the internet look like? If that makes sense, like does it kind of like make you go back and like have new ideas for how that initial infrastructure might have been different to sort of like better serve the purposes or the kind of spaces you're trying to explore, or the kind of environment that your data you would like to see your data in?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it I talked a bit in my presentation about you know, it wasn't the technology itself that made the internet personal. It was, you know, people and like natural human urges that made the internet personal. Um, and I showed some examples on a slide quickly of, you know, a bulletin board system, and you know, instant messengers, and a couple other things. Um, and I don't know. It's like what I like about looking at these older technologies is that they just feel a little bit less prescriptive, or a lot less prescriptive, and there is you know, room on a BBS to make this system work for a specific community, and you can create a like more localized, maybe not geographically localized, but localized in terms of the community that is using it. You can create this sense of a localized feeling there. Um, I I'm not sure what that looks like right now, to be honest. I think when communication happens at such a massive scale, um, I don't know what it means to create that sense of, you know, community and specific context. Um, so yeah, I'm not sure. It's something I think about a lot, and don't know really where it's going.
I guess I'm kind of like, what I'm kind of thinking about is, you know, things such as, um, you know, like the pirate box, or like when you can like create your own local Wi-Fi. That's, you know, like your own local network, and host files on there that only people within a proximity can access, or maybe something like mesh network, where, you know, only a neighborhood can access the shared information. And I guess I'm just like wondering whether you have any interest or see any connection between like the you know, your interest and approach towards data, and something like that kind of like focuses on like hyperlocality.
Yeah, I think definitely. Like, I think that it's, I think there may be like a, you know, a thin line between like, because on one hand, like part of what makes the internet great is that it is accessible, and it has a wide reach. So I love the idea of, you know, um, localized communities on the internet, and you know, mesh networks. So it's like, how do you create those types of spaces, but also retain this feeling that all people can access it, um, which is, I think, a tension I think about a lot.
I'm definitely fascinated by your nostalgia for an experience of the internet from an era that you did not actually experience firsthand, right? Like, I think that that is actually really fascinating. Could you talk a little bit about how you researched the sort of, you know, early sort of launch of the web, and the kind of, I guess, social groupings, communities, and technologies that you know, you ended up highlighting? Because I find this actually really fascinating. The sort of generational preoccupations, if you will, of you know, sort of prior events, and then primarily how those experiences unfolded in the time that they happened, but then also the ways in which those experiences then become represented in our current day, so that, you know, for example, someone like yourself might look at activity going on in chat rooms and bulletin board systems and think to yourself that that represents a more genuine or somehow authentic experience than the one you're experiencing now. And I'm not saying that it is or it isn't. I think I'm fascinated by this mechanism of looking back and sort of distilling that experience, especially what kind of factors are contributing to that impression.
Yeah, I think all the time about like, am I looking at this time and just like painting a perfectly rosy picture of it because I never experienced it, or are there, very real factors at play that made this internet more just and accessible and fun, maybe. Um, and I think there's probably a little bit of both there. And I think what brought me to like going back and looking at these other technologies is it comes from doing research into the current technologies that we have, and what are the shortcomings here.
So I guess I'm curious about like what's your next project? Like, do you have any thoughts on like what the next thing is going to be?
So I think, like I said, I've been really like drawn to search as a thing to go deeper into, and like while there's different data types that I want to look into, um, I started building this site with the idea that it would be a home for a lot of different explorations of this idea. So something that I haven't explored that deeply yet is creating an element that connects multiple people. So right now I've focused on looking at your own information and like giving that different forms. But in a lot of the experiments I was doing, like the most interesting thing was when people started to share what they were finding with each other. And it's like they came across a question they asked about like about what classes they should take in freshman year of college, and maybe they talk to somebody else and they're like, oh, you were wondering about that too around the same time, or like I don't know, finding commonalities in data sets is super interesting to me, and how that can be a starting point for something deeper. I have thought a little bit about like making a dating app type of thing out of this information, and what that could look like. Those are a few of the things.